Hello there, my fellow music lovers. Thank you so much for hanging out and dropping by this channel and for all that you do. I love all the comments and the feedback. It's really great. So thank you so much. In this video, I wanted to revisit Live Aid. Remember that? That huge concert from 1985. It's 33 years ago this summer. July the 13th, 1985, that we had Live Aid. I remember I could not wait for this. I mean, when I heard the bands that were going to be playing, and this was a major concert that was going on in Philadelphia and in London. And so you had these two major concerts going on at the same time. You could watch it live, and that's what I think really separated this from a lot of the previous events that we had. We already had Woodstock in 1969. We even had the US Festival, which was out in California, which was just a couple of years before Live Aid. Lots of great bands played there too. But Live Aid was live. You could sit and you could watch it as it was happening. We had cable television was in full swing. MTV was in full swing. And so, it was just quite an event. And I remember that I could not wait to see Queen. Of course, I've talked many times on this channel how I'm a huge Queen fan. And you didn't get to see Queen live very, very much. The last time I had seen them live at this point was on Saturday Night Live. They performed a couple of songs, and that was their first U.S. live appearance. And so when I heard that they were going to be at Live Aid, I had my VCR set, and I was ready to go. I could not wait for them to come on. I didn't know when it was going to happen, but it was coming. And I'll get to them in a little bit here. This video, I apologize if it gets a little bit long. I don't know how long it's going to be because there's a lot of stuff to get into, and I'm kind of really going over the highlights. I hate to make really long videos, but I assume that if you don't give a shit about Live Aid, you're probably not going to be watching this anyway. So I'm going to go over what I think are some of the highlights. I've always found it interesting looking back in retrospect how this was, to me, the going away party for the 80s. A lot of these bands, they were either on their way up, they were on their way out. Some of these bands, you never heard from them again. And they had been wildly popular in the early part of the 80s. I always kind of thought that the 80s ended around 1985 after we started getting into the later part of the 80s. I mean, yeah, there was some good things, but for the most part, I thought that the quality of music started to tank. And that might have been because of MTV. A lot of bands that were just purely out for their image, little on quality. We started to get a lot of that in the second half of the 80s. And, we'll go through this here. And I should also mention, too, that this concert, the whole point of it was to raise money for starving children in Africa. It was organized by Bob Geldolf and also concert promoter Bill Graham. Now, this concert came on the heels of a couple of really big singles that were also aimed to raise money for the same cause. You had Don't They Know It's Christmas, which came out in late 84. That was a British song. It came out with a bunch of British artists singing on it. And then, of course, we had We Are the World, which was in January of 85, which was the U.S. response, and it had Lionel Richie and Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson spearheading that. And that reminds me, I need to dig up my interview with Lionel Richie. I got to meet him in 2000, and he's a really good guy. He talked about We Are the World and how they all got that assembled, because when you think about it, all the egos that were in that room and all the parts that they had to sing, he really went into detail as to how that all came to be, and that was really cool. I'll try to find that. And so the concert gets kicked off in London, and we get Status Quo, Style Council, Boomtown Rats. Of course, that's Bob Geldolf's band, the one who organized this whole event. Adam Ant is there. Of course, he's a guy that's on his way out. I don't think Geldolf really wanted him there. That was more of a Bill Graham thing. Ultravox. I was a fan of Ultravox. I was starting to get into them. They were never big here in the States, but they were huge in Europe. And I really enjoyed watching One Small Day and Vienna, which closed out their set. I'm going to try to put links to stuff downstairs so you can check it out. Spandau Ballet were next. They're a band that they were huge here in the States, but after this, they were gone. We never heard from them again. Very, very big over in Europe, though. Still are. Elvis Costello, Nick Kershaw. We had Sade. Sade, of course, I loved her at this time, was getting into her. She was on her way up. She's still really, really big. And we had Sting and Phil Collins. They did a set with each other. It was kind of like a solo thing. They did Long, Long Way to Go, which was really cool. That was a song that was on No Jacket Required, Phil Collins' solo album, and Sting sang on that on his album. And so that was just a natural fit for them. Glad to see that one. Howard Jones was after that. He's another guy, very, very popular in the first part of the 80s here in the States, but after that, never really heard from him again. But I believe he went on to do some things over in Europe. Brian Ferry, Paul Young, he's another one. Really big here in the States. After this, crickets, gone. But he's very, very popular in Europe. All right, so next up we have U2, and this is something I was also looking forward to. And, you know, they did a pretty amazing set. They only did 2 songs, Sunday Bloody Sunday and Bad. Bad was on their new album at this time, The Unforgettable Fire, and they did like a 14-minute version of Bad because Bono noticed that there was a young female fan getting crushed right at the, like where the barrier was, and so he jumped off the stage and went down to get her. And the band didn't know what the hell was going on. They just saw Bono leap off the stage. They couldn't see him. They didn't know if he had fallen. They didn't know what was going on. They just kept playing and just kept playing and playing. And they were actually starting to get pissed. They thought that they had blown it, but it was actually quite the opposite. And I think that if Queen hadn't done as well as they had done, I think you'd be hearing more about the U2 set. But Queen kind of, you know, they just overshadowed everything on that day. And I had heard that many years later it had come out, the girl that Bono rescued, she said literally that he saved her life, that she would have died if he hadn't come down there. So that would have been interesting and quite amazing. So we get Dire Straits after that, and then we've got Queen. Oh yeah, I was waiting for Queen. Could not wait for them to come on, and they were just amazing. They are considered to be the best band of that day, and I've even heard people talk about how it might be one of the best live performances ever in rock history. That's how good it was. They overshadowed everybody. They made the best use of their set. They had a lot of songs that they did. They mixed up old stuff and new stuff. Freddie Mercury commanded the audience. He had them eating out of his hand, call and responses. People were just in lockstep. You look at when they did Radio Gaga, people were clapping and all this stuff. It was just amazing. And people, I've heard stories about people who were backstage wondering who's got their shit together. What's going on out there? I mean, they commanded the audience like nobody else did. And they kicked things off with Bohemian Rhapsody, which says a lot. This is their biggest song up to this point. And they start things off with that. It's interesting to look at their set and what they chose. And this is why I often do set list reviews on this channel, because I'm always fascinated by what bands choose and, you know, old songs versus new songs and all that. And Queen starts off, like I said, Bo Rap, out of the gate. Shortened version so they could fit in some other stuff. Then they do Radio Gaga, which at that time was their hit single in Europe. In the States, it was kind of a so-so hit. And then they do Hammer to Fall, which is from The Works, from the same album as Radio Gaga. You know, again, digging into some brand new stuff, but it was amazing. Brian May jammed on that one. Crazy Little Thing Called Love, then We Will Rock You, and We Are the Champions. And this is all Freddie just, you know, hamming it up to the camera, engaging the audience. Brian May was on fire. It was just, after that set, I remember just looking at that going, I can't believe it. I'm so glad that I recorded this. I must have worn that damn tape out. And so glad that it's come out on Blu-ray and it's been restored and all that. It's definitely one of Queen's most crowning achievements. No pun intended. Or maybe I did. I don't know. And so then we had David Bowie. He actually did a really good job. A lot of people consider his set to have been one of the best. Then we had The Who, which was really anticipated because, you know, they had broken up a few years earlier in 1982. They announced that that was the end. And so we hadn't seen them for a few years. They came back. Their set was kind of hit and miss. There were a lot of technical problems. There was even a blown fuse at the BBC, which interrupted the broadcast. Overall, it was very ho-hum, not something that a lot of people talked about, I don't think. I mean, it was good to see them, but it did not go over very, very well. Then you had Elton John. And so then we had Freddie Mercury and Brian May of Queen. They actually came back out, and just the two of them, they performed a quiet song from their new album, The Works, called Is This the World That We Created, which just happened to fit in perfectly with the overall theme, and they did a really good job with that. Then we get the end of the show. Paul McCartney comes out and he does Let It Be. He had some issues with his microphone. I had even heard that he had overdubbed his vocal for the live DVD release. But that was kind of like a star-studded affair. They did Band-Aid with Do They Know It's Christmas, and that closed out the show. And so London had a lot of great performances. Queen, of course, was it. That was the performance that everybody talked about. But, you know, London did a great, great job. And we're going to get to Philly next. All right, so we get the Philadelphia part of the Live Aid show kicked off by the Hooters. And this is another band from the 80s that after this, you didn't hear from them much at all in the States. This was pretty much it. The Four Tops. Billy Ocean, he's another one. After this, where is he? He's gone. Black Sabbath, they had a reunion with Ozzy Osbourne for the show. I heard that they were all drunk. This was at 10 o'clock in the morning. Ozzy hadn't played with Sabbath since 1978, and he wouldn't get back with them again for another 15 years or so. Run DMC, they were like the only rap artist at the show. And of course, there really wasn't a whole lot of rap going on at this time. They were kind of breaking ground, trying to get rap and hip hop out into the forefront. And so that's what they were doing there. And they kicked ass. They were really good. And of course, Rick Springfield, after that, he's another guy. He was very, very popular in the first part of the 80s. After this, he may have had some hit singles, but nothing like it used to be. REO Speedwagon, there's another band. You know, most of their great stuff was already done. They were really about to enter kind of a dry spell after this. Crosby, Stills and Nash, Judas Priest, Bryan Adams, he was on his way up. The Beach Boys, they had Brian Wilson. They turned in a pretty good set. George Thorogood. All right, so then we had the Simple Minds, and there's a band that didn't do anything after this. They were done here in the States, although they did go on to have a lot of popularity elsewhere. The Pretenders, for the most part, they were done here in the States too. Not much happening with them after this. Santana, they were there, and they were not happy with their set from this show. They even made sure that it never saw the light of day on any kind of official release, along with Zeppelin, and we'll get to them in just a little bit. Ashford and Simpson, they performed with Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy had an accident that left him paralyzed, and this was a few years before this, so this was his first public appearance live. He was in a wheelchair, and he performed with Ashford and Simpson. Then we had Madonna. And this was very much like a coming out party for her. She was on her way up. A lot of people hadn't really seen her perform live. Of course, we had seen her videos and all that. She had recently released, or at least Playboy had released, some nude photos of her. So she was starting to blossom and get a lot of attention. And we get to see her live here. And she turned in a great set. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Kenny Loggins. You know, he's another one. I love Kenny. But after this, he was done. You didn't really hear a whole lot from him. I mean, he did have some minor hits, but I'm talking about bands who were like in their heyday, where like they were the shit and people were talking about him and they were hot stuff. He was on his way out. The Cars were after that. They're another band. They were done after this. I think they had one more album. They had the album Door to Door, but that was a major flop. What I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of bands where it's like, this was it for them. This was their going away party. After this, the golden years were done. They may have had a couple of hits here and there, but for the most part, a lot of these bands were done. Neil Young, Power Station, remember them? Power Station was a great little band with Robert Palmer and a couple of the dudes from Duran Duran, and also Tony Thompson, the drummer from Chic. And I always loved that band, that first album that they put out. And they didn't perform with Robert Palmer at this show, though. They had Michael DeBar, because I don't think Robert Palmer wanted to play live didn't want to do the show, and for that reason, I thought that their show sucked. I really didn't care for Power Station with anybody else other than Palmer. I mean, that you got to have Robert Palmer for Power Station. And so I really did not care for their set. Then you had the Thompson Twins. You want to talk about a band that was on their way out. I mean, after this, nobody gave a shit about the Thompson Twins. I don't know that they really did much after this. Eric Clapton, he did a set that was well respected, really cool. Then we had Phil Collins. Last time I talked about him, he was in London. He took the Concorde, flew over here to do this set in Philly. And yeah, Collins is a kick-ass dude, man. He really is. Then we get Zeppelin. More Phil Collins. He was the drummer, along with Tony Thompson of Power Station. They played with Plant, Page, and John Paul Jones, and they had a Led Zeppelin reunion. This was the first time we saw Zeppelin playing since they broke up in 1980. There was a lot of anticipation for this. People were wondering, are they going to do anything? Is Zeppelin going to show up? And then when they finally did, you know, what a disappointment. Zeppelin hated their set so much that they will not allow the footage out. This did not make the official Live Aid DVD. One of the biggest problems, of course, Robert Plant's voice was kind of hoarse. Jimmy Page's guitar was out of tune. There was a lot of friction between Phil Collins and Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page claims that Phil Collins didn't know what he was doing and that he stunk it up. Phil Collins didn't have very nice things to say about Page. It was just a total fucking mess, and it's a reunion that Zeppelin would like to put behind them and never talk about. After that, we had Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Then we had Duran Duran. And this was another band that I was into at this point. I was a big Duran Duran fan. I liked their first album, and Rio, and Seven and the Ragged Tiger had some good stuff on it. And then they did this song for the James Bond movie, A View to a Kill. And during that song, Duran Duran was plagued with some audio issues, and Simon Le Bon just hit this real bum note, and it's regarded as, like, you know, the bum note that was heard around the world or something. It was just a very embarrassing. I think Simon has said that it's like the most embarrassing moment of his career, because it was live on television, and you know, it was. I thought that they sounded pretty good, actually, outside of this song. But this was the last time that Duran Duran played with the original members until like 2003. This was it for them. There was a lot of conflict going on inside the band. And, you know, this was it. We didn't see Duran Duran for a little bit. They actually went through some personnel changes after this. And they did go on to have a lot more success. It was just not with the, you know, original guys. Then we had Patti LaBelle. We had Hall & Oates. They came out and they did a set with Eddie Kendricks and David Ruffin. So they did some of their own stuff, like, you know, Out of Touch and Man Eater, and then they did like a Motown set. And for Hall & Oates too, you know, as great as they are, this was pretty much it for them. They really never had the same popularity after this. They had a couple of minor hit singles in the late 80s or something in the early 90s, but for the most part, this was it for them. And so then we get to the finale of the whole thing in Philly, which to me was a bit of a letdown. You know, we got like Mick Jagger with Tina Turner doing some stuff, and then you had Bob Dylan and Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood doing some things. And to me, it was just a letdown. They had like a We Are the World sing-along, and, you know, where was Bruce? Where was Bruce Springsteen? Where was Prince? You know, where was Michael Jackson? There were a lot of bands that were not there for one reason or another. They either didn't take it seriously, didn't think it was going to do anything. They may have not been able to get their shit together, to get band people in place to make it happen. They may not have agreed with the whole charity aspect of it in terms of really believing the money was going to get to where it should have. There were some bands that weren't even asked. So I'm sure that your favorite band, had they been around in 1985, there probably is a story tied to why they weren't there. So I want to know what you think about this whole Live Aid event. You know, was your favorite band there? Why weren't they there? Were you watching this live? What did you think about this? And so looking at it from a bootleg point of view, there's a lot of footage that did not make the official 4 DVD release for Live Aid that came out many years ago, and that's because some of the footage was just not usable. There was, audio problems, and then when they had to look and see what else they could go to, a lot of these stations that were broadcasting were not doing it in stereo, and so they didn't want to put that out. Then you had bands that just did not want their stuff out there too. So I've probably got about 3 DVDs worth of extra footage from this show. A lot of it's available on YouTube now. I'll try to put some links to that stuff below. Overall, like I said, I think that this was a great event, lots of great performances, and it was a going away party as far as I'm concerned for the 80s. A lot of the bands that you see in this show that made the first half of the 80s great, that are associated with the 80s and having had a lot of success, or maybe they peaked in the 80s, they were gone after this. You didn't really hear from them much at all. And so I think that the quality of music in the 80s took a bit of a hit after this. And I guess it depends on your tastes. We had the whole hair metal scene came in. I really wasn't into that. You did have the alternative scene kind of kicking in. You had bands like the Smiths and REM were kind of like on the rise, and the Cure. You did have that element there. But in terms of pop music, we started getting more of the Rick Astley and the Paula Abdul stuff. And by the time we get to the late 80s, it just seemed to me like pop music had become really, really plastic, extremely image-driven. And it took the 90s to kind of really shake things up and bring things back to reality. But I want to know what you think. What do you think about Live Aid? What do you think about this whole 80s going away party? Do you agree with that? Comment below. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. Be sure to subscribe, and I will talk to you later.